Well, it happened again. Another high-profile celebrity makes a stupid comment of pooling ignorance about Jewish people supposedly killing Jesus. Actor Jamie Foxx posted on Instagram Friday to millions of his followers about Jews killing Jesus. To be fair to Mr. Foxx, he later apologized, removed his apparently anti-Semitic post, and explained that he never intended to spread anti-Semitic rhetoric. Now, I want to make something very clear apart from these celebrities. No Jews killed Jesus. Not only is this slander, enabling of genocidal hatred against anyone Jewish, it also is absurd anachronism. Biblical scholar John Eliot wrote, "Jesus was neither a Jew nor a Christian. This is true at diverse levels and stages of discourse. For one thing, Jesus was neither a Jew nor a Christian in the sense that these terms are used today in ordinary discourse. As Jewish scholar Jacob Neusner and a growing number of scholars have been emphasizing for decades now, the concept Jew, as understood today, derives not from the 1st century, but from the 4th and following centuries Common Era. Jew and Jewish denote persons shaped by and oriented to not only the Torah and the Tanakh, but the Mishnah, Midrashim, and Talmudim. In similar fashion, the name Christian, as used and understood today, designates persons marked more by doctrines and events of the 4th and later centuries than by those of the 1st. Decades ago, Rosemary Radford Ruther had already pointed out that it was in the 4th century that Judaism and Christianity assumed the features by which they are known today. Indeed, Jewish scholar Daniel Boyarin cites Ruther with approval and apparently describes both collectivities, Judaism and Christianity, as twins in the womb until the 4th century. To call Jesus and the people he knew, the people who were with him and the people who were against him, as either Jews or Christians, as these words are understood in the vernacular today, not only confuses the matter historically, but has led to disastrous social and interreligious consequences. Right now in the news, we are experiencing tragedies because of this needless confusion. In the lexicon entry on Judaios, in a Greek-English lexicon on the New Testament and other early Christian literature, Frederick Danker laments that, quote, incalculable harm has been caused by simply glossing Judaios with Jew. For many readers or auditors of the Bible translations do not practice the historical judgment necessary to distinguish between circumstances and events of an ancient time and contemporary ethnic, religious, social realities, with the result that anti-Judaism, in the modern sense of the term, is needlessly fostered through biblical texts. Now, according to these scholars, there are no Jews existing in New Testament times, and for several centuries after the composition of the New Testament library. Thus, not only are statements about Jews killing Jesus grotesquely evil and stupid and easily misused to theologically justify genocidal hatred, they are also ridiculous as there were no Jews in existence when Jesus was alive. By perpetuating the anachronistic false idea that Jews populate the pages of the New Testament, please look at the images of the faces I'm showing you because these people perpetuate this nonsense. And by perpetuating this anachronistic false idea that Jewish people populate the pages of the New Testament every time we read our simply incorrectly translated English versions, we further enable this serious evil to perpetuate. All Christians must scratch out Jew and Jewish in their Bibles and lectionaries and replace these errors with Judeans. That is the correct translation. And pastors and priests and bishops who obstruct this, folks, you all are partly to blame for pooling the ignorance and dangerous stupidity. Like my dad used to say, either lead, follow, or get out of the way. I invite you to please listen carefully to the following presentations based on culturally sensitive scholarship, some of it from Jewish scholars and even Israeli scholars. Thank you. Imagine the following scene from the Gospel called Luke. Jesus is giving a sermon in the synagogue. How do you picture it? Is Jesus behaving like a modern Jewish rabbi? Is he wearing a kippah, what later Yiddish culture will call a yarmulke? Perhaps you've been to service at a local Jewish synagogue. Do you think what is going on in Luke chapter 4 is like that? If so, think again, because if you imagine it that way, you are being grossly anachronistic. It wasn't like that at all. Language does not acquire meaning from lexica, dictionaries, or etymologies. Instead, all language, including biblical language, derives its meaning from the social system. We 21st century Westerners belong to an extremely different social system than that of biblical peoples. And we Western 21st century people indeed know Jews and Jewish beliefs and Jewish practices. But Jewish scholars like Shia Cohen and Jacob Neusner remind us that contemporary Jewish beliefs and practices are rooted in the formation of the Talmud. We are talking about the 6th century Common Era. The process of the evolution of the Talmud took centuries and happened after Jesus and the first Jesus groups, probably beginning around 90 Common Era. Some Jewish practices, like the bar mitzvah and especially the bat mitzvah, have no root in the Hebrew Bible or in New Testament times. Both John the Baptist and Jesus were called rabbis. Do you think that they were Jewish rabbis? It wasn't until long after their time that rabbis, as we now know and understand them, and the synagogue as a place of worship began to evolve. In the context of John the Baptist and Jesus, rabbi meant nothing more than a term of respect. It was a respectful, honorable way of addressing a great one, like important teachers. It derives from the Hebrew word rab, meaning Lord or Master. Rabbi today is an official position and title. This developed long after Jesus' day. Scholar Heather McKay has demonstrated convincingly that it was not until long after New Testament times, really not until 200 Common Era, that synagogues became places of worship. Synagogue never means Jewish synagogue whenever encountered in the Bible. In the first century, synagogue is not a place of worship. Think about Paul arguing for 3 weeks in a synagogue. Does that sound like a place of worship? It's more like a hostel or hangout place for Israelite males. There they hung out and did what Mediterranean males do everywhere in their hangout places. Talk, cuss, spit, get into fights, and argue about politics, in this case, the political text called the Torah. Israelite males did not gather there for services because no worship services existed at this time in synagogues. And in the first century, the Sabbath was a day of rest, not a day of worship. The Sabbath became a day of worship, and synagogues evolved to be places of worship when some Israelites reacted to the practice of Messianic Israelites in Palestinian Yahwism, anachronistically called Christians. These Messianists assembled to celebrate the Lord's Supper on the seventh day. A reaction to this caused an evolution. You know, we really should stop thinking of first century Israelites as either Jews or Christians. There were none at that time. As Rosemary Radford Ruther pointed out decades ago, it wasn't until the 4th century that Judaism and Christianity assumed the features by which they are known today. Jewish scholar Daniel Boyarin agrees, calling both Judaism and Christianity twins in the womb, developing until their birth in the 4th century. So there really is nothing Jewish or Christian about the New Testament. I mean, you could say the New Testament is Christian in its canonization, but that's about it. There's nothing Jewish or Christian about the New Testament's rabbis or synagogues. The Hebrew word Yehudim and the Greek word Judaioi should be properly translated Judeans, not Jews. The contemporary English word Jew is traced linguistically to the Middle English period. That's around 1200 Common Era. And it derives from the Old French, ultimately back to Latin, Greek, and Hebrew roots. But it is inappropriate as a translation of the Greek and the Hebrew to call Jesus a Jew or a Christian, as these words are understood in the vernacular today, not only confuses the matter historically, but has led to disastrous social and interreligious consequences. Most Christians know the Pharisees only from New Testament information. Ultimately, most Christians are terribly informed and share an erroneous impression about them. Most Christians confuse Pharisees, which sounds a lot like Farsi, the language spoken in Persia, with later medieval caricatures of Jewish rabbis, grossly distorted for genocidal hatred against Jews. It's just a mess all around. The problem became exaggerated because of the different contexts of Jesus' Galilean experience in the late 20s Common Era, and that of the very different experience of third and fourth wave Jesus groups who produced the Gospels decades later. Of all the political religious factions in first century Israel, and the Pharisees were one of many, the historical Jesus was most like the Pharisees. The big bad in Jesus' own historical experience were the greedy urban elites and their retainers. Some Pharisees were among them, but not all. The Sadducees were Jesus' big adversaries, but they were mostly wiped out by the time of Matthew and Luke. The new enemy facing third and fourth wave Jesus groups, mostly Israelite communities, were Ben-Zacchaist Pharisees who rejected the Messianists, the New Testament folks we anachronistically call early Christians. And so the authors of the Gospels retrojected these Ben-Zaccaists back into Jesus' day decades earlier. Please understand, when you read about the Pharisees in the New Testament, you are not getting historical photographs. Neither of Pharisees as they were in the 20s Common Era, in Jesus' village experience in the Galilee, nor the Ben-Zaccaists who lived decades later after the temple's destruction. Only a tiny portion of our New Testament library presents an honorable or fair report or interpretation of the Pharisees, who were, like the Jesus movement, a political, religious, henotheistic Israelite sect. Not a Jewish sect, that would be an anachronism, but an Israelite sect of the first century. We know the Pharisees formed a fellowship whose members practiced distinctive observances of prayer, fasting, almsgiving, and tithing, heavily influenced and founded on Persian customs and ways. They were very likely shamanic, like John the Dunker, Jesus and his followers, and Paul. inducing altered states of consciousness. Ultimately, when it comes to New Testament depictions of the Pharisees, it's the same thing you get when reading about Diotrephes, Jezebel, the Nicolaitans, the Synagogue of Satan, Ananias and Sapphira, Simon Magus, and of course, Judas Iscariot. You are only getting one end of a telephone conversation. Folks, don't read the Bible to get God's own personal opinion on who the bad guys are. That's not what Revelation is about. Last time we showed that neither Jesus nor his earliest followers were Christians. We saw why we really shouldn't use the word Christian for anyone or anything earlier than about 300 Common Era. As far as what Christianity is today, we owe it all to Constantine. Our churches, our liturgies, the stuff we wear at liturgy, the stuff we do. All the familiar stuff. It all comes from the time of Constantine. So then what should we call earlier believers? You know, people from the First and New Testaments. Okay, so let's go back in time to around 1800 BCE. This is the time period of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What do we call these people? At this time, we find the mysterious Apiru. Sounds a lot like Hebrew. Apiru meant outsiders. They were a wide configuration of nomadic peoples. Sumerians tell of a group of Aramean nomads living in southern Mesopotamia as Apiru. These motley, non-related tribes settled wherever they wanted, and many of them were considered robbers and murderous raiders. So what was Abraham? He was likely Apiru. The Hapiru continue through 1400 BCE and the time of Moses. You know, there are so many layers to the history by later peoples, so many recontextualizations. Unified initially under the short-lived Davidic and Solomonic kingdoms, between 950 and 587 BCE, we encounter Israelites. But the history of ancient Israel is marked throughout with several significant and irreversible changes stemming out from major social alterations. At the end of this time, radical geographical change and displacement occurred, and Israelites were expelled or forced into one-way emigration. Others were forcibly brought into the land via one-way immigration. All of these peoples had little hope of returning to their place of origin. This is the formation of the so-called diaspora. From 520 BCE all the way until 70 Common Era, we have the period of the Judeans. Judeans is the right translation of Yehudim in Hebrew and Judaioi in Greek. Judeans are all those people who lived or originated in what became the Persian colony of Yehud, under Persian cultural influence and rule around 500 BCE. During the Persian period, with the formation of the Persian colony of Yahud, south of Samaria, and the adoption of Persian customs by the various peoples who worshiped the god Yah, third-generation Yahud people, with their temple in Jerusalem, were proud of their Persian origins, as indicated by the adoption of many Persian customs. For instance, their use of esoteric language in their sacred writings, or the idea of the eternal flame in the temple, or belief in angels, and devils. The special role of the Satan. The idea of a garden called paradise. Resurrection belief, where the righteous dead are transformed into stars. As well as by the formation of a Parsi political religious group called Pharisees in the New Testament. And all those old stories about Moses, or even earlier ones about Abraham and his family before, were composed by Persian-authorized scribes. For example, Solomon's Temple. Did it ever exist? Folks, it is probably entirely mythical, created by Persian scribes. By the way, this stuff never gets covered by popular speakers and authors like Scott Hahn or Robert Barron. These people present the Bible like it's one big linear timeline of events, like from an epic novel or movie. So what do we call Israelites living in New Testament times? Well, you can never go wrong by calling them Israelites. In fact, the best thing to call them is Israelites. Outsiders to the Roman province of Syro-Palestine living at the same time might have collectively labeled any native from the land of Israel as Judeans, or barbarian Israelites. That is, Israelites who live in the land of Judea, speak the barbarian language Aramaic, and adhere to barbarian customs, like the dietary codes and genital mutilation practices. But what if you were an Israelite living in the land of Israel? Well, then you would distinguish your fellow Israelites regionally or geographically. And in that case, you would consider somebody to be a Judean if he or she lived in the vicinity of Jerusalem. But if they lived around the Sea of Tiberias, you would call them Galileans. And if they lived in the eastern Transjordan, you would call them Pereans. But you know what nobody would call them back then? No one would call them Christians or Jews. None of these people are Christians or Jews. You see, at this time, Pharisees, Sadducees, Jesus group people we could call Messianists, Essenes, and other political religious sects, but there were no Christians or Jews yet. Contrary to widespread spurious belief, Christians and Jews come centuries later on. How did that come about? Well, in order to understand that, we have to see what took place in the year 70 Common Era, and what happens after 70 Common Era. Try to imagine what a cataclysm the destruction of the temple at the hands of the Romans was for the Judeans. Can you appreciate how earth-shattering that must have been? Israelite faith was all about this temple. It was where you, as an Israelite, went on pilgrimage 3 times a year. The sole place you worshipped, meaning offered sacrifice. This temple is what your faith was all about. This temple was how you did your practice. Now, temple was gone. So what were Israelites going to do? During the Roman destruction of henotheistic Israel's central temple, the center of their life, the center of political religion, new social structures or new social situations emerged. 2 prevailing Israelite groups learned how to breathe underwater. They evolved away from prevailing political religion to newly exclusive fictive kinship religion. Everything got redefined and reshaped. And all those other Judean groups that could not adapt, they went extinct. After 70 Common Era, legendary Pharisee Yochanan ben Zakkai founded the academy at Yabna. Eventually, Rabbinic Judaism sprang from this. And eventually, out of this and further developments, the Talmuds were produced, the Babylonian and the Palestinian. And the Judaism we know today, practiced by Jews, is rooted in Talmudic practices. But the Talmuds come around 500 Common Era, and therefore there are no Jews before at least 500 Common Era. In fact, Jew is a medieval English word inappropriate to describe anything prior to 500 Common Era. Christian, as we saw in a previous video, is inappropriate to apply to anything prior to 325 Common Era. The analogy for the relationship between Jews and Christians, then, is like that between sisters in the womb, not between parent and child. Therefore, at the end of the first century, Jesus groups may be thought of as Israel awaiting the theocracy proclaimed by Jesus, and Ben Zacchaeus groups may be thought of as Israel awaiting the restoration of the temple. Consider this. Back in 1000 BCE, David's court storyteller, someone called by scripture scholars the Yahwist, combined older Semitic myths and legends, some going way back deep into Apiru times, and made a new story. This new story recontextualized the older myths and legends about the patriarchs, all giving justification for the Davidic kingdom's existence. Folks, please, when you're reading the Bible, don't look for Ancestry.com DNA-accurate bridges between heroes and events, okay? Memories get updated, reshaped, retold. Historically speaking, the Exodus story was invented by Judean scribes 1,000 years later during the Persian period, modeled after their own immigration from Persia. In other words, the relationship between Judeans in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah and legendary Abraham the Apiru is mythic. Understanding that helps us a great deal in recognizing the same about how Jews and Christians today relate to New Testament times and groups. Please don't look for Ancestry.com DNA-accurate apostolic succession links when you're reading Matthew chapter 16 or John chapter 21. And in the same way, don't look for that between Jews and ancient biblical peoples either. The genocidal hatred Christians have perennially unleashed against Jews is not only horrendously evil. The theological justifications used repeatedly to excuse pogroms, expulsions, and even worse atrocities committed against Jewish people are also absurd. There were no Jews existing in Jesus' day and for centuries afterward. How can we then blame Jews for rejecting him or crucifying him? Not only would doing that be evil, it would be ridiculous. The same thing goes for theological justifications fundamentalist Christians use for racist Zionism and its genocidal actions against Palestinians. Is there really a Judeo-Christian tradition? Many writers today take it for granted that there is. But when we look closely at history, specifically at the Jewish tradition, and the Christian tradition, our spurious familiarity with expressions like Judeo-Christian tradition, Judeo-Christian values, and Judeo-Christian ethics might be in for a shock. The Gospel called Matthew is often imagined to be the most Jewish of all Gospels. Many today see Matthew's Gospel as the starting point of the so-called Judeo-Christian tradition. But what if this understanding is wrong, based on anachronistic thinking? What if popular designations such as Judeo-Christian tradition and Judeo-Christian ethics are simply false? According to context group scholars like John Pilch and Bruce Molina, there was nothing Jewish or Christian in the first century Mediterranean world, and surely nothing that might be called a Judeo-Christian tradition. Therefore, we cannot accurately claim that the European monotheism emerging in early Christianity after New Testament times and articulated so well in medieval Christendom was part of the Judeo-Christian tradition. The reason being because such a tradition did not exist. Christianity and Judaism, contrary to widespread spurious familiarity, evolved after. Indeed, normative Judaism, hence the distinctively Jewish tradition, does not emerge until at least the late 4th century Common Era. That according to Jewish scholars like Jacob Neusner. The Jewish religion originates at the same time Mediterranean Christian elites, in Constantinian and post-Constantinian times, debated about the relationship of Jesus to God, the so-called Christological controversies. Both traditions, of course, Christian and Jewish, are 5th century outcomes rooted in the post-exilic Israelite world of 1st century Palestine. When it comes to words like Christian and Jewish, the same rule applies. Language only means what it means, where and when you use it. Whether it is words or sentences, whenever you move the language, you necessarily change the meaning. It isn't dictionaries and lexica that provide the meanings to words, folks. Social systems do that. Those evolve and change, and with it, so goes the meaning of language. Because words, like language itself, have their meanings from social systems, Bible translators and interpreters are essentially anachronistic when they assert that the New Testament Greek word Judaios means Jew, and that Judaismos means Judaism in the sense of Jewishness. Actually, Judaios means of or pertaining to Judea, a no longer existing reality. Judaismos means the behavior typical of and particular to those from Judea. Jewishness, and those espousing it, Jewish people or Jews, are a post-4th century phenomenon at the base of the Jewish tradition with its Talmud and rabbinical structure. The fact that people known as Jews today have their kinship religion rooted in the Babylonian Talmud should indicate to us that this form of religion dates back to the Babylonian Talmud in the 5th century Common Era. Furthermore, to develop a Judeo-Christian tradition and Judeo-Christian values and Judeo-Christian ethics, there would have to be a sustainable, positive, traditional Christian interaction with Jews, and vice versa. But any such interaction in any positive, non-hostile, constructive sense that might have formed a Judeo-Christian tradition did not happen until after the 18th century European Enlightenment. Indeed, historically, Christians have brutally persecuted Jews in genocidal hatred. Even today, among professed Christians, there are alarming indications of the hideousness of this growing.
The thing about it, me and Adidas, is like, I could literally say anti-Semitic and they can't drop me. I could say anti-Semitic things and Adidas can't drop me.
Finally, the actual reference to a common Jewish-Christian tradition emerges only in late 19th century Northern Europe, when Jews began to frequent Enlightenment universities. Much development has happened since. Recently, great strides have been made in interreligious dialogue, and this great work needs to continue. But it also needs to be intellectually and historically honest.
You know, lately, in Paris, in London, in New York, people are speaking about the Judo-Christianity. You heard about it? Civilization. Judo-Christianity civilization. People like the term. In the first book I wrote that my aunt, didn't know when they pushed her to Auschwitz that one day Europe The Western world will define itself as a Judeo-Christian civilization. It's nice, no? There is not a Jewish Christian civilization. There is a Christian civilization that oppressed the Jewishness much more than all other civilizations in history. This is the truth. And this minority became a very tough minority, believing that a chosen people, it was one of the conditions, sine qua non, to stay a Jew, to know that you are a chosen people. You have to understand, Jewish ethics, in my point of view, are not the ethics that I dream of. Why? Because in Jewishness, the ethics is intergroup. You say it in English, intergroup? It's not universalist ethics, you have to understand, much less than Muslims or Christianity. Why? Not only because of the Bible, because it was a minority that suffered from strong power around it, that developed an intergroup ethics. But you don't have, in the Jewish ethics, you don't have a cosmopolitism ethics, universal ethics.
So, what can be said of the prevailing religious tradition, values, and ethics of the United States? Celebrated by so many in spurious familiarity as a Judeo-Christian nation. The fact is that, for better or worse, the prevailing religious tradition of the United States is Euro-Christian, and at its root stands the monotheism facilitated by Roman imperial monarchy, the social structure that served as analogy for this fundamental Christian religious perspective. Holy and absolute mystery called God works in the mess, folks. Therefore, the God once understood in the henotheistic Israelite tradition, with the analogy of an ethnic patron god, Yahweh, for an ethnic chosen people, is seen by Christianity to eventually be revealed in the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, a Galilean of the house of Israel, as being the God of all humankind. According to this Christian perspective, developed long after New Testament times, now all humans are actually, or potentially, God's chosen people. And what about the gospel called Matthew? This first-century Messianist Israelite document predates both Jewish tradition and Christian tradition. Apart from later Christian allegorical interpretation of it, Matthew should not be thought of as originating from either tradition, or imagined to be a starting point of a fantastical hybrid.
Two weeks ago, I was in Akron, Ohio, at the House of the Lord. Obviously not a Catholic church, it was evangelical, and the founding pastor and Bishop Joey Johnson invited me to come and do Bible seminar from 6 to 9 on Friday evening and 8 to 12 on Saturday morning. They're very intense, these people. And when he introduced me, he said that he was that he himself, Bishop Johnson, was a graduate of Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, so he was Pentecostal in origin, evangelical in orientation, and he said he studied well and read everything, and then all of a sudden he found my works, and he said it messed me up, and and he's probably going to mess you up too, but don't worry about it. Then at the very end, when I finished on noon on Saturday, he told the participants, I know you're all messed up now, but now you know the difference between BP and AP. Before, you were before Pilch, and now it's after Pilch. So that's going to be particularly true this week, since what I'm sharing with you is a book in progress with my colleague Bruce Molina. We're writing a social science commentary on the authentic letters of Paul. It's more important for me that we get all these ideas clear, because I suspect for the vast majority, if not all of you, everything I say is going to be very different from what you had previously heard. I'm not doing it just to be different. These are the conclusions that I think real scientific scholarship can validate and confirm, but it will be different from anything that you are accustomed to thinking about Paul. Paul belonged to that generation of the Jesus movement which stood between the Jesus group and the evangelists. His 7 undisputed letters make it clear that Paul considered himself to be an Israelite prophet sent by the God of Israel to Israelites who were residing among non-Israelites. He had little to no interest in Gentiles, even those who believed in Jesus. Paul considered them to be like branches grafted contrary to nature onto Israel, the true root. And so this program will present Paul in a fresh perspective, inviting participants to explore his role as a change agent commissioned by God to proclaim and prepare for the forthcoming theocracy. So to begin with, we need to establish some basic vocabulary. And the first thing on the terminology and basic vocabulary is there were no Christians in the New Testament. In fact, you don't have any Christians existing before Constantine, the Council of Nicaea in 325. Result of this, I will explain it in a moment, is that we should not this week, please humor me, talk about Christians at all unless you're asking modern questions about modern times, or at least if your question pertains to something after the Council of Nicaea. There are no Christians before that. The second point, which we'll also explain in a moment, you cannot use the word Jew before 500 AD. You and I know Jews. We have Jewish friends. We're familiar with Jewish synagogues. I mean, it's not strange to us, but what we are familiar with in the 21st century is rooted in the Talmuds, and they date from 500 AD. I may have told you this the last time I was with you. Bar mitzvah. You're all familiar with bar mitzvah. Maybe you've had friends whose children were bar mitzvahed, or if they're in Reformed congregations, the daughters were bat mitzvahed. Well, when did that come into existence? Not until 500 AD. Jesus wasn't bar mitzvahed, Saul wasn't bar mitzvahed, Samuel wasn't bar mitzvahed, nobody in the Bible was bar mitzvahed. But you and I know this. That's contemporary Judaism. That's contemporary Judaism. So please don't use the word Christians before 325 AD, and please don't use the word Jews before 500 AD. Well, what are we going to use? What kind of words will we use? I talk about the Jesus movement, and I'll use that, I hope, consistently, the Jesus movement. That's Jesus and the group of his immediate circle of followers. Notice I'm not using any numbers. Number 12 is a symbolic number. It isn't necessarily literal. You probably know that from your other Bible studies. So we refer to this as the Jesus movement. And then after Jesus' death and resurrection, there are Jesus movement groups that formed. But all of those groups, it's important to recognize, did not consider themselves separate from Israel. They were groups in Israel. They were Israelites. They did not consider themselves anything else. So instead of Christians, the term that we suggest we might use would be Messianists, because these were Israelites who accepted Jesus as Messiah. Now I have for you 3 references. These are the only 3 places in the New Testament where the word Christian is used. Let's take a look at them. If you have your Bible, Acts chapter 11, verse 26. And when he had found them, he brought him to Antioch. Barnabas went looking for Paul, and he found Paul, and he brought him to Antioch. And for a whole year, they met with the church and taught a large company of people. And in Antioch, the disciples were for the first time called Christians. So remember, perhaps the last time I was with you, I pointed out to you the importance of recognizing the passive voice. Maybe you recall that. Passive voice means someone else did it, right? So if they were called, by whom? By others. They called themselves that, the sentence would say, and they called themselves Christians. But nowhere in the New Testament does it ever say that's what they called themselves. It's always passive voice. They were identified by, and it wasn't a nice word. It was the equivalent of a four-letter word. It was, I don't want to use another initial, but certain bad words that we will just designate by the beginning letter. Well, that's what Christian was. It was not a good word. So called by others. Go to 26:28. Acts 26:28. In this part of Acts, Paul is on trial, and he's trying to make a case for himself, and he's preaching very mightily to King Agrippa here, or Festus, excuse me. In verse 24, Acts 26:24, Festus says with a loud voice, "Paul, are you mad? Your great learning is turning you mad?" And he says, "No, I'm not mad." And Paul tries to try to convince him of the importance of Jesus. And then when you go down to 28, and Agrippa said to Paul, "In a short time, you wish to make me a Christian?" It's an insulting thing. You think you're going to persuade me of your foolishness? You expect me to follow that nonsense? I don't want any part of it. So again, it's an outsider that uses this term. And then the third and only other time in the New Testament where the word occurs is 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 16 to 17. Start actually in 15 if you like. 1 Peter chapter 4, 15. "But let none of you suffer as a murderer." We're jumping into it. What he's saying is, whoever's writing this letter is saying, you're going to have to suffer. So under what conditions will you suffer? Well, please don't suffer as a murderer. Don't do that to deserve suffering. Or a thief, or a wrongdoer, or a mischief maker. If you're going to suffer, don't suffer on account of these things which are not good for anybody to do. Yet, if one suffers as a Christian, you're going to suffer for it, because those people are calling us by that name, and they're punishing us for that name. Let him not be ashamed, but under that name let him glorify God. So the only times in the New Testament where this word Christian appears, it's used by outsiders, and it's not a good designation. So there are no Christians in the New Testament. Okay. Next thing, we cannot use the word Jew before the year 500 AD. So what do we call these people? Well, we can divide Judaism historically into three periods. The period of the first temple, that is the mythic Temple of Solomon from 950 BC to 587 BC. If you look in your Bible and you have a good literal translation, the references, for example, in Genesis, not so much Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, or 1-2 Samuel, 1-2. If you look in there, you will see Israelites or sons of Israel. If you have these god-awful inclusive language translations, it's going to be children of Israel. But no, not only is this language very simple with 3 consonants, it's very gender divided. It's gender specific. There's nothing inclusive in here. So it's sons of Israel, that's literally not what it is, but we call them Israelites in this period. Then, after the temple was destroyed and rebuilt in 520, this is the second temple. So 520 BC to 70 AD, the Bible calls them in Hebrew Yehudim, and in Greek they are called in the New Testament Judaioi. And the proper translation is Judeans. So in John's Gospel, the sign over Jesus' name is Jesus of Nazareth, King of Judeans, not Jews. Can't use that word before 500 AD. So we ought not use it to translate these Greek and Hebrew words, which literally should be translated Judean. So the Jesus movement group, Jesus and the Jesus movement group, Jesus is not a Jew, neither is Paul a Jew. They are Judeans, the best way to call them. How do you identify people? Always by geography. Where are you from? In John's Gospel, when they get to Nathanael, they want to know where he's from. Because if I know where you're from, I know everything I need to know about you. Don't need to know anything more, as long as I know where you're from. So geography is an important marker, and all of these people dispersed around the globe who believe in Yahweh believe that Yahweh is worshipped in the temple in Jerusalem, and the temple in Jerusalem is located in Judea, and so these would be called Judeans, people whose origins are from this area, Judeans. After the year 70 AD, when the temple was destroyed, one of these Judeans, an Israelite named Yochanan ben Zakkai, he founded the academy at Yavne, Jamnia, in which rabbinic Judaism took place. So once the temple was destroyed, what are you going to do if your whole life was devoted to sacrifices and slaughtering animals and things of this nature? You can't do that anymore. So now you have to invent something new, and that's where Judaism emerges. It begins to develop. Beginning in 70, this academy was started around 90, actually was established, and then came to fruition in 500 AD in Babylon, where they compiled the Babylonian Talmud, and in Palestine, where they compiled the Palestinian Talmud. And so as I have there, culminating in the Talmuds, modern-day Judaism is rooted in Talmudic practices. Jew is a medieval English word and inappropriate to describe anything prior to 500 AD. So the conclusion of this section, what was the Jesus movement groups? What were they looking for? They were Israel awaiting the theocracy proclaimed by Jesus. What about those who stuck with Ben Zakkai? No more temple. What are these Israelites going to do now? The Ben Zakkaiist groups formed after 70, and they were Israel waiting for the restoration of the temple. Please don't use those words Jew, don't use the word Christian if we're talking about biblical times. Try to get accustomed to using this proper vocabulary.
Many people believe that the story of Israel in the Bible is the actual history of Israel, but the historical facts disagree. The reality is that in the Persian Empire of the 5th century BCE, what remained of historical Israel was Samaria. That's right, the only people we can really point to as guaranteed true blood biological descendants of Israelites in the time of Jesus were the Samaritans. Yep. When Judeans insultingly called Galilean Jesus a Samaritan, ironically and in terrible ignorance, they were calling him a genuine Israelite. Funny how things work like that, huh? Judea started off as a Persian colony. Back in the 5th century BCE, that brand new Persian colony of Yehud had been established by the donation of Cyrus. Only a tiny handful of Persian transferred elites governed the Persian colonists and all the surrounding peasants. To really anchor and justify their rule over the population required the invention of a new foundation story. And that explains why and how the Babylonian exile story got shaped. And something else was needed. A set of somewhat familiar older stories, now recontextualized to enable this tiny Persian colonial enclave to establish among the mostly illiterate peasant population their antiquity. They've been here all along. If they could establish the antiquity, they would establish their authority. Colonists and foreigners invading from far-off Persia, taking over? No way! These new elites were not immigrants to Judea. They were returning exiles. They were princes coming home. Good thing for them that reading and writing skills only belong to a precious few. This new set of stories and recontextualized older myths and legends, composed by Persian authorized elite scribes, resulted in the biblical story of Israel. And it provided the credentials for these Persian colonists, new Judeans, to claim to be the true Israelites.
In fact, we know from Roman texts that people in the Roman world who did become newly rich and wanted to move up the social ladder hired genealogists to create fictive genealogies for themselves. And there were a few stars in the pantheon of Roman ancestors they all wanted to be associated with. For a fee, you could get that association. Now you have the map that tells everybody where you fit in the pecking order of things. And that has an enormous impact on your life.
This kind of political storytelling and inventing the story of a people was nothing new in the land of Israel. 5 centuries earlier, David's retainers and storytellers had done the same thing. When David ascended to the throne, they reworked earlier Semitic myths and legends of Apiru warlords to point to the Davidic kingdom. It was all part of the plan. By the 3rd century BCE, Judea proper was only a tiny part of Palestine. Judea was so small, in fact, you could honestly identify it by pointing at Jerusalem and the tiny region encircling it. That's just how Polybius understands Judea in the middle of the 2nd century BCE. Outside it were Samaria and Galilee. So all Judeans living at the time of Jesus had a relationship with Abraham and the patriarchs, with Moses and King David, that was mythological. That doesn't mean it's not true. It's just not factual. Myth is that which will always be true but never happened. And for the past 2,000 years, different religious groups have continued with mythological links to Father Abraham. Christians, Muslims, and Jews all call Abraham their father. And you know, he is in a mythological sense, but not a biological sense. Some people today, unfortunately, make a terrible mistake. They confuse the story of Israel found in the Bible with the history of Israelites. Even worse, they confuse the biblical story of biblical Israel with contemporary Israeli people. This is a big problem, folks.
You know, we are used to repeat the stupidities of our parents, especially the stories of the national education. You know, all my life I was speaking about Jewish people, Jewish nation. I was always speaking about the Jewish nation. What is a people? What is a nation? What is nationality? What is nationalism? You know, in the last 15 years, more or less, Israeli archaeologues discovered that the exodus of the Jews from Egypt didn't happen. It was a myth. The exodus, you know, the Jews from Egypt, Moses and all this. The archaeologue in Israel discovered that it is a myth, a legend. I remember the day that the first time I heard explanation that, you know, this historical process didn't happen, never happened. And I understood that everything is possible. You understand? Everything is possible with questions, not with answers. I ask you to try to imagine a peasant living 50 kilometers from Sofia 500 years ago. Do you believe that he knows that he is Bulgarian? Really? You thought about it? 500 years ago. They believe that 4,000 years before, people knew that they belonged to a Jewish nation. You understand? To speak about a people in the modern sense of the word, we need some education, general education, a standard language, and you know, a level of communication that is a product only of the last 100 years. You understand me? Then I don't believe that we can use the word people in the modern sense of the term on 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, or 4,000 years ago. And also Jews didn't exist for 1,000 years ago as a people or as a nation. The problem is, to build nations, you have to imagine back peoples. To create new nations, you have to imagine. It's not enough that you have a common language. It's not enough that you have a political common consciousness. You need to invent yourself to the back, to feel that you are something that is coming from very, very far. This is national identity. It's not enough to live the present. You need a long past. The Bible is not a historical book. Not the First Testament and not the second one. It's a very great theological text. No. I think that Palestinians of today are a mixture I think that it's a people, a mixed people, like all the people in the world. But the chance that a Palestinian will be a dissident is much greater than me and a lot of Jews that are in this room. Sorry again.